in your teaching, you focus heavily on 19th century in terms of literature. What are some difficulties students have reading texts from this age in history, and how does the century that you teach influence the way students read and discuss these texts?
That's a complicated question. I think one of the challenges is that it's hard. The language is different. I mean, it's English, but it's different. And the cultural preoccupations of the authors are not necessarily our own. They're writing in a completely different milieu, and so they have their own questions to ask, their own concerns to engage, and some of those questions and concerns we're long past those. So part of what makes a text interesting is understanding how it interacts with its context. And if you don't know the context, it's hard to say what makes a text valuable. What is it doing? So I think a couple of things that are challenging. One, it's getting students to not read these texts with their own assumptions about the world in mind, but trying to figure out how it was that a novel like Moby Dick was trying to negotiate its historical moment without any of the benefits of hindsight, which is what our students have. And I think hindsight actually can a lot of times lead to misreadings of Moby Dick or whatever novel you're looking at. So I think part of the challenge for students is getting around the language and getting into the context and seeing how these texts are very much engaged with their particular moment. The 19th century had a different aesthetic, and so it's a challenge to learn to appreciate that beauty is not some universal, unchanging category, that, what was beautiful in Shakespeare's time is beautiful today, etc. But that ideas of aesthetics and beauty have changed. So it's easy for a student to read a novel by Hawthorne and just disparage it as, oh, it's just so dense and boring, I fall asleep. And I appreciate that. I mean, that's okay to have those feelings, but then to try to think about why this novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, why it generated such an incredibly frenzied response in the historical moment that it was produced. I think it takes a lot of hard work, because the time is not, it's not that long ago, but in some ways it really is. And so I think getting students to learn to think outside of the contemporary moment is a real challenge, because we like things and we respond to things that align with our own assumptions about what is good and what is tasteful and what is pleasant and what is interesting. And if someone's reading a novel by Cooper, it's like, how do I manufacture interest in this book that seems so inherently uninteresting? But so that's why I take a class, and it's like my job to figure out how to manufacture that interest. But I think it's possible, and I think once you get by that initial hump, it's like anything. Once something that's really unfamiliar starts to become familiar, then your taste for it starts to change, and suddenly you might have hated Melville, and you end up loving him because you've done some hard work and changed the way you engage with these texts. So but it's definitely a challenge, because it's for a lot of students, what I teach is boring. So what do you do? How do you transform that? I think that's a challenge for me.